For years, there was one seat on that legendary set that felt like it practically belonged to her. She could make Johnny Carson laugh harder than almost anyone else who ever sat on that couch. And more than that, she had earned something even rarer than his laughter. She had earned his trust, the kind of trust that let him hand her the keys to his own kingdom whenever he wasn't there to run it himself. Then, in the space of a single phone call that never actually happened, all of it disappeared. There was no slow fade, no gradual falling out. Just an ending so sudden and so total that it would last for nearly 3 decades, all the way until after the man who imposed it had passed away. This is a story of how one of the funniest women in America went from Johnny Carson's most trusted partner to a name he refused to speak, and why. Even after his death, the door she was locked out of stage shut for years longer than almost anyone in television history could have predicted. To understand how far she fell, you first have to understand how high she had climbed, and just how hard she had to fight to get there. She broke into comedy in the early 1960s, grinding through small clubs, hostile crowds, and rooms that had absolutely no idea what to do with a woman standing alone on stage. At the time, stand-up comedy was overwhelmingly a man's world. Female comedians were treated as a novelty at best, an irritation at worst, and audiences simply weren't used to hearing a woman talk about her own insecurities, her dating disasters, her body, and her family with the kind of rapid-fire, unapologetic honesty that dared people to laugh at things polite society told them not to say out loud. Some rooms booed, some walked out entirely. Club owners sometimes told her flatly that women simply weren't funny, and that audiences would never accept it. She kept going anyway, night after night, city after city, because she was convinced she was funnier than the reaction she was getting, and in time, she was proven right. Her breakthrough moment came in 1965, when she landed her first appearance on The Tonight Show. Every comedian working in that era understood exactly what that stage represented. A single strong set could change the entire trajectory of a career overnight, while a bad one could end a career before it ever really started. She walked out that night nervous, largely unknown outside comedy club circles, and improving on a national stage. She walked off a star. The host, a man famously difficult to impress and even more difficult to make laugh on command, leaned toward the camera as her segment wrapped and told the audience on air that they were watching someone who was going to be a star. For a comedian trying to break into an industry that had spent years telling her she didn't belong on that stage at all, that kind of public validation from the single most powerful person in late-night television was priceless. It changed her career overnight, and it planted the seed for what would become one of the most important professional relationships of her life. Over the following 2 decades, she became one of the most frequent guests the show ever booked, but eventually she became something considerably rarer than a frequent guest. She was named the show's permanent guest host, one of a very small handful of performers ever trusted to sit in that chair and run the entire program, whenever its regular host needed time off. In the world of late-night television, that distinction carried enormous weight. It wasn't simply a professional courtesy. It was a public statement that this particular performer could carry an audience, could carry an entire broadcast format built around a single host persona, and could be trusted with an institution that had taken decades of careful cultivation to build. For a woman who had spent years being told she didn't belong in the industry at all, being handed the keys to arguably the most powerful chair in American comedy was an extraordinary vote of confidence, and by most accounts from people who work around them at the time, it reflected a friendship that went well beyond simple professional courtesy. But underneath the warmth and the trust that had built up over 20 years, tension had quietly been accumulating, and most of it had very little to do with any personal falling out and everything to do with money, creative control, and the rapidly shifting landscape of network television in the 1980s. By the middle of that decade, she had become one of the biggest names in American comedy in her own right, and she knew it. She wanted more creative freedom than a guest host role could ever offer her. She wanted a bigger platform that carried her own name at the top of the marquee, and after years of proving herself as someone else's most trusted substitute, she wanted a kind of financial security and billing that came with being a headliner rather than a permanent understudy waiting for someone else's night off. At the same time, a fledgling network was aggressively trying to establish itself as a serious competitor in the entertainment industry. and it needed exactly the kind of proven, bankable talent that the major networks had spent decades carefully cultivating and protecting. She was precisely the kind of established name that network wanted to build around, and eventually, after negotiations that reportedly stretched on for some time, she said yes. The problem was never really that she left. People leave jobs, even good ones, even jobs they love, when a better opportunity comes along. The real problem, the one that would define the rest of her relationship with Johnny Carson, was how she left, or more specifically, how he found out about it. According to multiple accounts from people who were close to the situation at the time, Carson did not hear the news privately, and he certainly did not hear it before it became public knowledge. He reportedly learned that his most trusted guest host, the woman he had personally called a future star on his own broadcast decades earlier, had signed competing late-night deal with a rival network the exact same way most of the country did, through a news report. There was no private phone call beforehand to give him a heads up, no quiet conversation to let him hear it from her directly instead of reading about it in the press. No chance for him to process the news on his own terms before it became a headline. For a man who had spent more than 2 decades building his entire public reputation on loyalty, discretion, and almost obsessive protectiveness over the show he had built from the ground up, that particular omission was, by every account, unforgivable. It wasn't simply business to him, and it wasn't treated as an ordinary competitive hire the way it might have been for anyone else. It felt deeply personal. The kind of hurt that comes not from losing a competitive battle, but from feeling betrayed by someone you had genuinely considered family rather than a rival. And when Johnny Carson felt that kind of hurt, those who worked with him for years say he rarely responded with a public statement, an angry phone call, or even a passive-aggressive joke buried in a monologue. Instead, according to those who witnessed the aftermath, he simply erased her from his professional life entirely. The ban that followed was immediate, and it was absolute. She was not invited back on his show under any circumstances, not as a guest promoting new work, not as a guest host filling in for a missed night, not for any reason at all, for as long as Johnny Carson remained in charge of that program. What made the fallout even more brutal, according to people who worked in the industry during that period, was a ripple effect it created well beyond her own booking status. Word reportedly spread quickly that any performer who chose to appear on her new competing program risked damaging their own relationship with the single most powerful gatekeeper in late-night television. In an industry built almost entirely on relationships, access, and carefully maintained goodwill, that kind of quiet, unofficial warning carried enormous weight. Being publicly associated with her new show suddenly came with a real professional cost that many performers and their managers simply weren't willing to risk, which made her uphill battle to establish her own competing program even steeper than it might otherwise have been. She tried to reach out and repair the relationship. By multiple accounts given over the years that followed, she made genuine attempts to explain her side of the story, to apologize for how the news had reached him, and to remind him of everything the two of them had built together across 2 decades of friendship and professional partnership. None of it worked. The man who had been so publicly warm toward her and so privately generous with his trust for her so long reportedly never spoke to her again for the rest of his life. Not a phone call, not a written note, not even a brief, cordial exchange at one of the countless industry events where their paths inevitably crossed over the years. The silence, by her own later accounts, lasted all the way until his death in 2005. By that point, an entire generation of late-night viewers had grown up never once seeing the two of them appear together on screen again, unaware that they had ever shared anything beyond a passing professional acquaintance. For years afterward, the ban functioned almost like an unwritten rule, baked directly into the show's culture, something everyone in the building understood without ever needing explained out loud. The hosts who eventually inherited that chair after Carson's retirement in 1992 inherited, along with the desk and the format and the audience, an unspoken understanding that her name simply didn't belong on that particular stage. Nobody needed to issue a memo. It had simply become part of the institutional memory of the show itself, quietly passed down the way certain unwritten rules often are, long after most people working there had any personal memory of the original falling out that created it in the first place. It took almost 30 years and a full changing of the guard at the very top of that chair for the freeze to finally break. In 2014, A new host who had grown up idolizing both her and the man who had originally banned her decided that enough time had finally passed, and that keeping the old freeze alive no longer served anyone, least of all an audience that had missed watching one of the sharpest comedic minds of her generation work on that particular set. He invited her back publicly and warmly, treating the moment for exactly what it was: a long overdue reunion between an audience and performer who arguably never should have been kept apart in the first place over a professional slight that had, by then, outlived almost everyone directly involved in it. She returned to the very stage where her career had first taken off decades earlier, older, sharper than ever, and every bit as fearless as she had been on the night she was first told she was going to be a star. It was, by nearly every account of that night, a genuinely bittersweet homecoming. The man who had made that original promise to her all those years earlier wasn't there to witness it, and never would be. Whatever reconciliation might eventually have taken place between them, if any reconciliation had ever truly been possible, had been permanently foreclosed 9 years earlier by his death. What she received instead was something smaller, quieter, and more symbolic. One more chance to stand on that particular stage, to remind an entirely new generation of viewers exactly why she had mattered so much to begin with, and to finally, quietly, close the book on one of the longest-running personal and professional estrangements in the history of American television. Looking back at the entire arc of the story now, it reads less like a single dramatic betrayal and more like a slow-motion collision between two enormously talented, enormously stubborn people who each genuinely believed they were justified in how they handled an impossible situation. She wanted to build something bigger and entirely her own after decades spent proving she deserved exactly that kind of opportunity. He wanted loyalty, discretion, and a simple heads-up from someone he considered close enough to owe him at least that much warning. Neither one of them was entirely wrong in their own account of events, and neither one was ultimately willing to bend. And the result was a silence that ended up outlasting an entire era of American television. It's worth wondering, looking back, whether either of them privately regretted how it all ended. She spoke about the estrangement publicly on more than one occasion over the following decades, usually a familiar mixture of dark humor and genuine sadness, which was more or less how she processed almost everything difficult in her life, on stage and off. He, famously guarded about his personal grudges throughout his career, reportedly never addressed the situation directly on camera at all, letting his silence speak for him in a way that felt entirely consistent with how he handled every other conflict in his private life. Whatever regret either one of them may have quietly carried, by all available accounts, neither one ever said the words that might have ended the freeze while there was still time left to do so. What remains decades later is one of the most talked about ruptures in the entire history of American late-night television, a reminder that even the warmest and most seemingly unbreakable professional relationships can be permanently undone by a single moment of miscommunication, and that some doors, once they're closed, stay closed for far longer than either side ever intended when the door first slammed shut. In the years that followed her exile from that stage, she went on to build an entirely new legacy for herself across other networks, other formats, and other stages in front of new audiences who, in many cases, barely remembered the original falling out at all. But for the viewers who did remember it, and there were plenty who never forgot, the noticeably empty chair on that particular set, for those particular 28 years, told its own story every single night that it stayed empty, without a single word needing to be said. There's also a quieter, less discussed layer to this story worth sitting with. Long before the falling out, she had spent years navigating an industry that treated women in comedy as an afterthought at best, and Carson's early public endorsement of her talent had, in a very real sense, helped force open doors that had previously been shut to performers like her. That makes the eventual rupture feel even more complicated in hindsight. The very relationship that had once represented a rare and hard-won validation for women in comedy became, decades later, a symbol of exactly how quickly that same validation could be withdrawn, and how little room the era's biggest institutions left for forgiveness once a line had been crossed. Whether that reflects poorly on the era, on the individuals involved, or simply on the unforgiving nature of live television itself, likely depends on who you ask. What do you think? Was the punishment fair given everything that came before it? Or did one badly timed announcement cost her something she never should have lost in the first place? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, Don't forget to subscribe, and stay tuned for more untold stories from Hollywood's golden age.